want to welcome everybody today to our third pilot episode of DABEL Tech Talks. We have a special guest appearance today from Zoe the Bernie Doodle. Zoe, thank you for joining Mr. Jean-Pascal Deillon and myself. She won't be sticking around. She's just here because she was interested. She heard tabletop exercises and she assumed that involved treats. So she will have her treat, and then she won't care about me anymore. So let me throw up my intro slide for the folks here so they know who JP is. And let me see. Let's start there. JP, can you see my title slide?
Yes, sir, I can.
Great, great. So welcome everybody to the third pilot episode of DABEL Tech Talks. My name is Dale Bondanza. My company is DAB Enterprises, LLC. My organization helps companies get to the next tier of success despite the forces set against you, with a militant focus based on people, process, and technology. In that order, don't get it wrong. I have with me today our special guest, Jean-Pascal Deillon. He goes by JP. JP is an emergency management and homeland security professional dedicated to helping organizations prepare for cyber incidents. For nearly a decade, JP has designed tabletop exercises as a consultant on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security, that's DHS, for local and state governments, medical centers, colleges, transportation authorities, financial services firms, telecom companies, and utilities. Geez, who hasn't he worked with? Today, he operates his own consulting agency, helping companies, executive teams, cybersecurity leaders, and their cybersecurity plans, and evaluate their crisis response capabilities. He also delivers cybersecurity training as an adjunct instructor for Texas A&M University's Engineering Extension Service. Giga Maggies. So thank you, JP, for joining us today. Is there anything else that I missed on that?
No, Dale, good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm really appreciative and excited to be here. You've pretty much covered it. I've been able to conduct exercises throughout my career across all sorts of different clients, all throughout government, whether it's federal government at the White House level, all the way down to local government, municipalities, counties, cities. And then throughout critical infrastructure, like you mentioned, private sector, academia, and so on and so forth. So bit of experience there in training and exercises.
Great. Well, thank you. So what can cybersecurity leaders learn from the field of emergency management? I'm not sure how those two tie together. Maybe you can straighten that out for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think of emergency management, I think of law enforcement, fire, emergency medical services, right? EMS, urban search and rescue, the kinds of folks that you need to call in when a crisis happens. Now, what each and every one of those disciplines has to do is they have to respond to unforeseen events. And so as a result of that, they prepare ahead of time, right? These teams have plans in place, and more importantly, they train against those plans. Because they're going to run into situations where there are a lot of unknowns. And so one of the things we recommend for cybersecurity leaders and businesses in general is you may want to do the same thing for cybersecurity. You may want to have a plan in place. If you get hit by an incident, we all hear people say, in cybersecurity, it's not about if you're going to get hit by an incident, it's when you're going to suffer potentially a cybersecurity incident. And so we like to think of the emergency management principle around the culture of preparedness, is what I call it, as something that cybersecurity and business leaders can apply around their cybersecurity programs. So, in an incident, you're going to want to collaborate with others. You're going to have resources you're going to need to bring to bear. You're going to need to think of staffing. You may have equipment that you need to also bring to the incident and to respond and recover adequately from the incident. And so all those things are things you want to think of in advance. So you've got your plans in place. And then what you want to do with those plans is you want to make sure you exercise them. And that's kind of where my specialty lies, is in developing tabletop exercises.
Okay, so incorrectly, when I'm thinking of exercise plans, I'm not thinking cardio and lifting weights. I do have a couple dumbbells here in my office if we need to do some chest presses or benches or so forth. But so straighten me out there. Define what exactly is a tabletop exercise.
Yeah, so a tabletop exercise, I really sum it up as a crisis response readiness activity. And it's for leadership teams. So I know in cybersecurity, we look at some of the technical equivalents, perhaps attack simulations on cyber ranges, or blue team, red team exercises. maybe even penetration testing could be considered an exercise. Those are for your security teams, but for your leadership teams, you really want to build a forum for them to walk through a crisis, how they would respond to that crisis, and then figure out if there's any gaps in your preparedness. So the way you do that is you build a fictitious but realistic crisis scenario based on the organization, based on their operational posture, based on their security maturity. And then you get the leaders in that room, perhaps a conference room like the one in my Zoom background here, and you walk them through that scenario. Each phase of the scenario, whether it's incident, immediate response, and maybe long-term recovery, walking through leaders through that incident to understand what are the different operational impacts to their organization and what are the different decisions they're going to have to make throughout a crisis.
So interesting. So the benefits of that seem obvious. To say that, if an incident occurs, obviously it's better to be ready. What are some of the other, other than being prepared, kind of a twofold question is what other benefits exist? And also because you just gave a great example, that use the room behind you. Who are the folks who should be sitting in those chairs and at that table behind you? And what are the other benefits of doing it besides just being prepared?
Absolutely. So to your second question there, who should be in the room? So it should really be anybody that would be involved in the response to a cybersecurity incident. So that's typically your leadership team. So definitely your CEO. You're going to look at your CISO, your CTO, anybody with chief in front of their title. You're going to want to involve. You're going to want to bring in your human resources. If you're looking at a data breach, HR is going to be involved perhaps. And then I would say most definitely you want to bring in your PR team. Cyber incidents are rarely confined to an organization. They often, leak to the press or to the media or to the public. And so a big piece of responding to an incident is your crisis communications. You may also want to bring in vendors if you rely on vendors for your IT systems, or even just partners for your operations. And if appropriate, maybe bring in folks from cyber insurance providers or even law enforcement entities you might need to coordinate with. It really depends on the maturity of an organization, who they want to bring in. If you're just starting out, if this is your first exercise, I'd say keep it small, keep it internal. And then as you mature, bring in those external parties, your vendors, maybe law enforcement, maybe legal counsel, your cyber insurance folks, and bring them in as you train and you look at more and more complex decision-making around the cyber incident. So that's your first question. Your second question was around the benefits. You're absolutely right. Some of the primary benefits are really straightforward, right? You're looking at improving response capabilities. So I think of exercises as sort of the best way to assess your cybersecurity readiness without actually having to go through an incident, right? So you put folks in a room, you walk step by step through what's going on, their courses of action, right? And you really are able to reveal gaps in preparedness when you do that. You do that in the blue sky conditions, right, before a crisis hits, so that maybe you can address those issues, you can update your plans, and then eventually when a crisis does happen, you're ready for addressing some of the major issues that are going to come up, and you're not going to be caught off guard because you've already thought through some of the processes. For example, when it comes to a ransomware incident, you don't want to get hit by a ransomware incident and think, okay, do I pay this or do I not pay this? Ideally, you've thought through that process and that logic and that catch-22 situation. And maybe you've even taken steps to make sure that you don't have to pay. Perhaps you've got backups and that kind of thing. So those are some of the primary benefits. I think some of the secondary benefits and maybe the long-term benefits of running a tabletop exercise is really enhanced awareness. So if you've got leaders in your organization or your company who aren't as familiar with cybersecurity, maybe they don't understand the threat landscape that well, or maybe they don't have a good understanding of how the organization would respond, walking them through a tabletop exercise is going to really open up their eyes, and it's going to really get them to understand, hey, this is a real threat, and the impacts and the consequences could be really dire if we're not ready. So that's the first thing I'd say, that over the long term, that again, that culture of preparedness starts to kind of permeate because everybody appreciates the threat a little bit more and they appreciate the impacts it could have. Another way your awareness could be enhanced really is your roles and responsibilities, right? It's one thing to say, hey, you would get in front of the media, and if you're a PR person and you would tell them what's going on about the incident, you would provide updates. that kind of thing. It's another thing to actually practice that. And so in, some of the exercises I've done, we've actually gotten a podium, we've gotten the PR person or maybe the CEO of an organization up at the podium, and we've had people role-playing the media, asking tough questions, and getting them used to that kind of forum and that kind of situation, so that if that incident ever occurred or a similar incident occurred and they had to go talk to the media, they'd at least have some of that practice. And so they would understand their roles and responsibilities a little better.
Okay, that makes sense. When you said you were when you talk about even in your intro, you've worked obviously in a variety of different industries, different verticals. When you're kind of designing the exercise itself, what are some of the things you're looking for? And then as you're conducting them, obviously, as you have all those folks sitting around the table, how do you know if it's going? How do you evaluate it? How do you know if it's going as planned, or that the executives that are sitting in the room are responding appropriately, and they're not just treating it as this is just an exercise. We all know that, this isn't real. Is there an element that, you add to it to make it really hit home? Because, and the reason I ask that is because, as you said, you have some key leaders in the room, especially if you're talking your CEO, your communications folks. This could be viewed, especially if there's a hack, if there's a data breach. This has been the downfall of a lot of companies. This has been the last project under the special project title of a lot of people who work for organizations, that it also clears the way for new talent to come into an organization. So as you're going through that exercise, how do you design it so that people are engaged, and then how do you know if it actually worked?
Yeah, so and that's kind of all wrapped into sort of how you design the exercise. And so the very first thing that you need to do is really you want leadership buy-in. Your leadership doesn't necessarily need to be part of the planning team, especially if they're going to be a player in the exercise. Maybe you don't want to give them the scenario background and get them to sort of prepare, perhaps. You want it to sort of be a surprise and get their authentic responses. But having that buy-in about doing this exercise is going to be really key. The reason is, when I come into an organization and I design an exercise, I know how to design an exercise, but I don't necessarily know all that much about your organization. So one of the things I will rely on as an exercise designer is subject matter experts. So I may ask you, hey, Dale, for your organization, who do I speak to about your cybersecurity program? Who do I speak to about IT? If you maybe want to include a physical security element in the exercise, we've done this many times where perhaps the initial intrusion is somebody getting access to the server room, plugging in a USB device or something like that. I might ask, hey, Dale, can I speak to your physical security person at your organization? And then from there, with all those subject matter experts in the room, we really design an exercise that is scoped properly. So you don't want something, you don't want an exercise that's too easy, or you don't want an exercise that's too difficult. I liken it to a video game. You want it to be just challenging enough that folks are, working through some of the issues. Maybe it's the first time, maybe they're experiencing these challenges for the first time, but they're not necessarily overwhelmed. They're just kind of throwing their hands up. So you want to scope the exercise and its objectives appropriately. And then when you design the scenario, one of the key things is you really want to make sure it's realistic, even if it's fictitious, and it's really got to be engaging. The reason you want it to be realistic is, especially with a cybersecurity incident, you don't want to say anything that, technically might not actually be something that would occur in an exercise. So for example, again, if I said, hey, someone's going to get into the server room and they're going to plug in a USB, and you say, well, actually, we have everything in the cloud, we don't have our own servers. Okay, well, that might not be a scenario we want to look at. We want to look at a different initial intrusion vector. So making sure it's realistic is really key. The way typically, and it's very easy in a tabletop exercise, if people are really getting something out of it, is if they're engaged. Engagement is really the key piece. So when we had the pandemic and we did a lot of exercises virtually as a necessity, it was a little harder to gauge people's engagement around the scenario. And if you're just talking like I am right now, you can't see people's faces. You can't see if they're having sidebar discussions about a specific issue. And so it's a little difficult to determine engagement, but that is typically the metric, especially in an in-person exercise, where you understand that, okay, people are thinking through things and they're starting to come up with, maybe different ideas or realizations. I did a city and county exercise where both law enforcement folks for the city and county were sitting next to each other. And out of the blue during the exercise, the county official realized that they actually depended on city systems to run, I think it was their CCTVs. They didn't realize that. And so it was a light bulb moment. They brought it up during the exercise and they said, hey, going forward, we need to address this. I believe what actually happened was the predecessor of that county official had maybe implemented this or was aware of this, but maybe it wasn't passed down. It wasn't the type of information that was passed down. And so what happened is it took an exercise where the city and the county officials were sitting with one another side by side, discussing some of the scenarios and what they would do to uncover this interdependency between the two systems. So I'd say, again, engagement, and that has to do a lot of the times with facilitation, making sure the facilitator is asking the right questions, and then getting down to the root cause of some of the issues. So if someone identifies an issue, it might be the result of some other problem, maybe further down the line. And so having a good, follow-up questions as a facilitator and listening to what the players are saying and some of their concerns or maybe some of the details they're bringing up, that allows the facilitator to pursue a line of questioning that gets down to the root cause of maybe an issue or a gap.
Okay, sounds good. So, when you're conducting these exercises, and I think you kind of touched on a couple of this already, but what are the most important factors to consider when you're conducting one of these exercises?
Yeah, so it all starts really with that planning at the beginning, right, and the design of the exercise. Again, as I mentioned, the planning team needs to have the appropriate folks, whether that be a project manager to really drive the exercise, to fruition. It's got to have the right subject matter experts so that we can really scope the exercise properly and make sure the scenario is accurately developed. And then once we get to the conduct of the exercise, I think it really comes down to two things. Again, it really comes down to having a good venue and then having a good facilitator. So when it comes to venue, like I mentioned, I did some virtual exercises. This is a little more disengaging for folks and for the players, especially if you're not responding and you're just listening in, and the exercise is a 2-hour or 4-hour exercise. People are probably checking their emails. They're probably doing something else. So one of the things I've used in the past is different polling technology or different chats to get people to engage. If they're not engaging verbally, to engage in answering questions and still having to participate in the exercise, even though they're not the ones with the mic. So that's one of the important things, is making sure folks are engaged. If you're doing a physical exercise, right, you're physically in a conference room, making sure that you've got a presentation up, you've got a venue where folks are sitting around a table. If you've got breakout groups, audio becomes a real issue. If you break out into separate groups, you want to make sure folks aren't talking over each other or the venue is too loud. So that's really key, and that's a lot of that is logistics. But once you have that really nailed down, I think it's having a good facilitator, someone who understands the organization enough and the scenario and is able to walk through some of the different incident response issues that an organization will face, challenging the participants, but making sure they don't feel necessarily like this is they're going to be at fault if they answer the wrong question or they answer the wrong way. Making sure that we identify that, hey, this is a low stress, no fault environment. You'll hear that a lot in the exercise community. We're trying to make sure that folks understand we're looking at their processes. We're not examining them as individuals. And then the third thing I would say to make a successful exercise is having good note takers and good scribes, because when you evaluate an exercise, which is really sort of like that last step of an exercise, you want to make sure that you can build an after action report that identifies the strengths that you saw during the exercise and also the areas of improvement. So having those note takers and those scribes is key. Your facilitator will not be taking any notes down. There's a good chance they're just going to be focused on facilitating the exercise and listening. And so I liken facilitation to a little bit of juggling. So you're listening to somebody answer a question you asked, but you're also thinking about follow-up questions to that answer, and also where you want to drive the exercise, maybe the next topic and who you need to ask a question to. And you're also keeping your eye on the time, right? So you're making sure that there's plenty of time left, or if there is no time left, that you're going to wrap up. So the facilitator is juggling a lot of different things when they're facilitating an exercise. So having note takers and scribes is really helpful.
Wish I had that for this podcast, as a matter of fact. It's funny you say that. So you obviously, clearly a lot of challenges there. So what are some of the other challenges when you're conducting these exercises? Because it sounds like, to your point as a facilitator, there's a lot going on. And other than, and you mentioned some, especially with those leaders you talk about chiefs sitting around the room, you're talking about, the distraction of emails and cell phones and everything else under the sun. And again, when they know that this isn't a real situation, but I agree with you that unless you plan these things out and prepare and practice them, nobody ever wants these things to happen. But my other comment is there's two types of companies: technology companies and companies who don't know they're a technology company. So you have to prepare. You have to assume, unfortunately, that this could happen, and that'll lead to my next question. But in the meantime, what are some of the other challenges that when you're conducting these exercises that you face?
Yeah, so I can think of two right off the bat. The first one being if someone doesn't like your scenario, they may challenge your scenario and raise a flag and say, hey, this wouldn't happen. Oftentimes, if that goes, unaddressed, that could derail an exercise, or, at the very least, that player becomes disengaged. So what I tend to do as a facilitator there is I tend to tell folks, look, it's not necessarily about how the incident occurred. I'll give you an example. If you have an IT individual, which I've had in an exercise before, say, hey, we wouldn't get attacked in this fashion, or our IT staff would have noticed this, and we have detection, mechanisms in place, so this wouldn't have happened. Right. The reason they're saying that is because they're afraid to look bad in front of their leaders, right? They're afraid that their leaders are going to think, man, my IT staff is not doing what they need to do to detect an incident. And so at that point, if we didn't address that in the development of the scenario, in the design phase, typically as a facilitator, what we'll say is, look, absolutely understood that is the case. But the focus here really is around the consequences of an incident and not necessarily how it came to be. And so we ask those folks to, we acknowledge their concerns. We acknowledge that, this might not be the most realistic scenario necessarily, might not play out 100% this way in real life, but the consequences could happen. And so we want to really focus and examine those consequences. That typically addresses the individual's concerns, and, as long as they feel like, hey, everyone in the room knows that they're not as vulnerable as maybe the scenario makes them look out to be, or what have you, they're typically, their concerns are assuaged. I also usually follow up during a break with that person. I thank them for their input, and just let them know that I've acknowledged their concerns, and that, I appreciate that, and that, they're helping me, in the organization with the exercise because they're identifying an issue, but, allowing us to move on and really focusing on the management of the consequences and the impacts of an incident. They're helping me out a great deal. That typically brings that person back onto your side, as opposed to, sitting there and completely checking out because, they don't agree with the scenario. So that's really that's one of the big issues. Another issue, you're right, is people are on the phones, people are distracted. So one of the things I've employed in my exercises is using multimedia. So for example, if we say that, hey, the news media found out about a crisis at your organization, it's a cyber incident, customer data is leaked, or what have you, it's in the 6 o'clock news, we will actually develop a multimedia video or a fake news report, of the 6 o'clock news with somebody reporting on your incident. That does two things. That really engages people. It really puts them in the situation of, oh my gosh, seeing my company in the news talked about in this way really engages folks. And then it also really gets leadership emotionally engaged, I'll say, because then they realize, oh yeah, this would look bad, and this would be a really bad day. And it puts them in that mindset that a written scenario may not necessarily achieve. So those are sort of the two challenges, and just kind of how we try to address that. The other big challenge is you often run out of time. If you're having a good exercise, like I said, that's engaging, folks don't want to stop talking. And so one of the other ways, now that I'm talking about it, that we know an exercise is successful is after the exercise is done, people are still sticking around in the room talking about the different issues, even though, the exercise was over 15, 20, 30 minutes ago. So that's another challenge as well, is always finding enough time to explore these issues in depth.
Okay, and I do have one more question, but you said something in that explanation that kind of triggered a thought. And it was funny. It's because when you were talking about, the IT person, maybe it's the CISO, maybe it's the CIO or the CTO that says, that scenario wouldn't happen. That's an interesting point, and something from my area, my area of expertise is in the portfolio management world. And one of the running jokes in project management goes all the way back to an old show, The Jersey Shore. That where they used to talk about the shirt before the shirt. In project management, we have the meeting before the meeting. Do you ever pre-meet with some of these folks, particularly your CISOs, your CIOs, before they come to the table to do these exercises, to let them know kind of exactly what you said? You almost got to do a little ego stroking in advance to say that, yeah, we know that it may or may not be completely realistic, but we also know as technology professionals that the best defenses in the world, there's still some evil people out there. If people intend to do harm, technologically or physically for that matter, oftentimes evil is going to win the battle. It's our job to win the war. So do you ever do a pre-meeting with any of those folks?
Absolutely. And that's part of that leadership engagement piece and leadership buy-in. Oftentimes before you even start an exercise, they've identified cybersecurity as a need. And so they want to have that meeting. They want to have that exercise. And so they're good. I should also mention that typically, in a business or in a large organization, an exercise, if you're planning it, designing it, and then if you're conducting it, involves people from across the organization. So having somebody with the authority to bring all of those people to the table and to take this initiative seriously is really key. So we engage leaders at that level, right? And then before the exercise, we typically will prepare them. We won't tell them the scenario, but we'll tell them, hey, these are the capabilities we're going to look at. Maybe these are some of the issues we're going to examine. And then, they might have their staff prepare them. So, even if it's just giving opening remarks, but even during the exercise, that individual typically has had a little bit of a pre-brief and some training from their folks ahead of time. Again, that is just another way to keep that leadership engaged in the exercise, and then eventually engaged in the evaluation. So when we find all of the different gaps that an organization might have from that exercise, again, leadership engagement is key to address those gaps. I'll give you an example though. When I was doing some exercises at the federal government level, a lot of times agencies would come in and they would already have pre-scripted answers to the questions that we had. So they demanded to see the questions ahead of time in some cases because they didn't want to be embarrassed. They didn't want to say, hey, we're not familiar with our processes. They wanted to make sure that they were ready to contribute effectively to that exercise. And again, if the intent of that exercise is to help every single agency participating understand what another agency would do, it is really helpful for somebody to come in prepared with talking points. So it really varies between the type of exercise you have, but the recommendation is, yes, don't catch your leaders off guard. Certainly don't embarrass them in front of their staff, or even, if there's external partners there, make sure they're prepared.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I can see where you say at the federal level, especially, people want to come in with their talking points. But I also liked your other example of kind of the city-county example. I've been involved in both city and county government in my career as well. And there's usually at least a little bit more collegial relationship the further you kind of go down that governmental chain. But yeah, that makes perfect sense. So kind of my, to kind of sum that all up, the other thing that strikes me is, because if I think about, geez, all the organizations I've been involved with, and all my friends that are CISOs, I have quite a few folks I know that are, obviously it's one of the hottest trends in technology, one of the hottest job opportunities that there are out there, is to be a cybersecurity leader. How often, when and how often should you conduct these types of exercises? Is this a once a year, twice a year kind of thing? Is it once every couple years? How often should people practice this? Because obviously, to pull together the folks that you're talking about into a room, that's no trivial task, to pull all these chiefs into the same room, whether it's physical or hybrid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So your first question there was, what do you need to conduct an exercise? I would say at the very
Yeah.
minimum, you should have an incident response plan, even if it's just a draft plan, even if it hasn't been adopted yet. You want to make sure that people are discussing some of their courses of action during the exercise based on what's in those plans and procedures. That also allows us to really evaluate properly, because we can say, hey, people spoke about doing, taking this course of action, but in the plan, it says something completely different. So make sure to update that plan with whatever the right course of action might be. So having a plan in place before you conduct an exercise, I think, is really helpful. I have done exercises with organizations who did not have a plan in place. Those conversations are typically a lot more free-flowing, and suggestions like, hey, we should probably do this and we should probably do that, and maybe non-committal, but at the end of the day, the after action report for those exercises will typically say you need an incident response plan. So that's the first thing. Your second question about how often they should do this. At a minimum, they should do it annually, and it's going to vary by sector. Some sectors, I know, for example, the financial services sector is a lot more strict than, let's say, maybe pharmaceutical sector, perhaps, when it comes to testing incident response plans. That may not be the case. It depends on where you are and where in the financial services or pharmaceutical sector you are. But if that is the case, you may want to look at your industry, may want to look at if you have regulations that you're required to meet, or maybe you have some sort of standard that you have for yourself. And even if you have cyber insurance, maybe your cyber insurance policy talks about when you should conduct an exercise and how often. So annually at a minimum, good organizations are probably doing it several times a year. And then there's another factor. It's not just how much time has elapsed between one exercise or another. It's also, if you have a brand new leadership team, if you've updated your plan, and that is within the year, go ahead and conduct an exercise. It's probably going to be very useful for new folks who've come in, right? But that new leadership, running them through an exercise. If you've got a new plan and you've updated your plan, you most certainly want to go ahead and test that plan. So if you had an exercise 6 months prior, but you've changed the plan and you can afford it, you have the time and you have the capability, go ahead and conduct another exercise, I would say. So it really varies on a number of factors, but most certainly at least once a year, minimum.
Okay, that makes sense. And to your point, with the rotation at the C level, at the executive in the boardroom, the average C level executive is typically only in place for 3 to 5 years. So that makes sense to your point of every time you have new leaders that come to the table, it's good to keep everybody on the same page and at least acknowledge that there is a plan, hopefully, and that whose responsibility should that be to make sure that plan is known? Is that the CIO, the CISO, the CTO, the CEO?
Mm-hmm. And another thing I'll say too is your exercise doesn't need to be a 2-hour effort or a 4-hour exercise with all of your executive team. Sometimes you can even do a small exercise. For example, ransomware payment. Would you pay? Would you not pay? Let's look at the consequences of each of those decisions at the executive level. That can be a 30-minute, 45-minute exercise that's done with the leadership team. So much more often, you can probably do those smaller exercises, but then bringing all that team together, yeah, absolutely. It's going to take a lot more effort and you're going to have time. You're going to have to find time on people's calendars.
Okay. Yeah, you brought up another, I'm totally going to write this down after we get done talking, because one of the words you mentioned more than a couple times in there is cybersecurity risk or cyber risk insurance. And I know I need a whole podcast just on insurance, because I recently attended a group of CISOs seminar on cyber insurance. Mm-hmm. And that is that's a tough subject, because that's when a lot of people in the world don't like when the insurance people and the lawyers are all in the same room. It gets very tense. And that, to your point, is a situation that is not comfortable no matter what level of the organization you are. Even if you are the CEO, you never want to be confronted by your lawyer and your insurance person in the room at the same time. Because that will certainly identify all the things that you didn't do as a leader.
Correct. And that's, you just brought up a great, additional reason for why, as a leader, you would want to conduct an exercise. And even, again, if it's one of those 30-minute or 45-minute exercises with legal counsel, your cyber insurance provider, just walking through, hey, here's what we would do in this situation. Here's what legal counsel would recommend. Here's what your cyber insurance policy maybe requires you to do. Walking through that ahead of time, like you said, it's tense if those folks are in the room and they're discussing this, especially following a crisis or during a crisis, I should say, following a cyber incident during a crisis. So doing that ahead of time is going to really lower your blood pressure if you're a leader who's dealing with a cyber incident. It's really going to lower your blood pressure in the long run.
Great. So that's all the questions I have for you, JP. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell the folks?
No, I think that's it. Again, I'd recommend having that incident response plan for your cybersecurity program. Like you said at the start, Dale, it's about people first, right? And then processes and technology. And exercises is about getting the right people in the room and discussing those processes and those technologies with regards to cybersecurity. So 100% agree. You should have a plan, and then you should test that plan regularly.
Great. So I will put in the post, I will put your websites and so forth in the YouTube description. But beyond that, how should folks, if folks want to learn more, how should they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so feel free to reach out to me. I'm really active on LinkedIn. You can just look up Jean-Pascal Deillon. Like when I think you'll pop up the slide here in a moment, Dale.
Yep.
Folks can look me up that way. They can also go to my company website, pascalcyber.com. That's PASCALCYBER.com. And then you'll see some of my links there to my socials. I do have a Twitter as part of my company. I don't use it all that much, but if your preference is Twitter, you can feel free to reach out to me on there as well.
Do you have a TikTok is the question, especially as a guy who works so much with the federal government?
I do not. No, I do not have TikTok.
That's probably a good thing. Probably a good thing. Well, great. So again, for those folks, here's Jean-Pascal JP's information. Feel free to reach out to him. Like I said, I'll include his links in the video on YouTube. And JP, thank you so much for attending today. I really appreciate you being a guest on the third episode of DABEL Tech Talks.
Thank you for having me, Dale. I appreciate it. This was great.
No problem. Thank you.